Welcome to On the Level, broadcasting from the Blue Ocean Network studios here in Beijing. My name is Fergus Thompson. For centuries, people from China have emigrated to other countries for various reasons, and today some of the largest and most visible immigrant communities in countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand are originally from China. But what about those who choose the road less travelled, those who emigrate to less traditional destinations? Countries such as Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, India, all of these are home to significant ethnic minority Chinese groups. What sort of different pressures and challenges do they face? Well, today, to discuss just this, I'm joined by author and journalist Karen Ma, who has herself lived through such an experience and in fact recently published a book exploring some of these themes. Karen Ma, welcome to On the Level.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Your book, Excess Baggage, tells the story of one of these, a family which emigrates from China back in the 1960s, first to Hong Kong and then to Japan. Right. You yourself and your family lived through something similar. Just how much of that story is your story?
I would say this novel is semi-autobiographical. So I have borrowed from my family's history for the larger framework. And I have changed a lot of the details, and I've added characters and taken out people from my family, So, I just wanted to explore this whole idea of immigration to an Asian country rather than, say, to a Western country, and also just explore some of the themes such as identity, the meaning of home, if you will.
Because the immigrant experience for Chinese people particularly has been fairly well documented, certainly in North America. In this particular case, the family is actually, it's not as simple as a family just going abroad together, but they're split up.
Yes.
Is this something that was common at that time, that some of the family would remain behind and some of them would go off to the new country?
I would say it's quite common. In my family's case, my older sister was left behind because there was a strict rule. Most of the Chinese families, when they first move out, they go through Hong Kong. Hong Kong is like, the first place. And you have to imagine, Hong Kong is a very small island. And for them to take on so many people, often it's just way too much. And they have to find ways to limit the numbers of refugees coming
so
to the island.
There were immigration restrictions.
Very much so. And in my family, there are 3 kids, and so the immigration in Hong Kong, they wanted to say only 2 kids allowed per family. And in fact, the rules would get even stricter later. I have actually read elsewhere, like in one case, a family with twins, they were told that only 1 child is allowed per family. They actually have to choose between the two twins. So that's part of the reason why my sister got left behind, because she's the oldest of the 3 children. And then the logic is that, she can be left behind and she would be easier to take care of by the extended family members.
So a life-changing decision, both for the ones that leave and the ones that stay here.
Yes.
It would seem, certainly in the book, you portray a sense of envy on both sides, actually. The family or the people who travel to the new country, in this case it was Hong Kong and then on to Japan, and the ones that stay behind. Is there a sort of a mixture of sort of envy, or the grass is greener on the other side of the fence?
Definitely, yeah. That the moon is rounder in the Chinese proverb, and I think that for the main characters are the 2 sisters, 2 Chinese sisters, and the younger sister, she's been taken out of her home country, an original country of origin, if you will, and she feels that she's always, she's not quite one of them. She always feels like she's this oddball and she doesn't quite belong. So she has this feeling that she's always jealous of those who are in their own home country and not having to apologize for who she is. Because when you are an outsider, a minority in another country, you have to be very aware of like your visa, when you're going to renew your visa, and you have to be a model citizen. You have to make sure that you don't get into trouble, or else you might get kicked out. And so she is very aware of this problem. And the older sister, on the other hand, she's being left behind and with the extended family. And eventually when she catches up with the family, she has this outpour of anger. Why am I chosen as the scapegoat? And you guys move on and have the good life. So I mean, both are probably only seeing one side of the reality. So nobody's actually having it so easy.
But this is something that you did find amongst the immigrant or emigrant experience in general, that there was a sort of a back and forth between those who stayed and those who went abroad.
Definitely.
Let's look specifically at the country which, both in the book and in your own case, this family ended up in, and that was Japan. We have quite a substantial number of Chinese people living in Japan as immigrants there, not for a year or two, but really for the rest of their lives. How is their status seen? I mean, Japan, we have this idea of a fairly closed society, a fairly sort of introverted society. Is there a sort of a ranking, for example, of foreigners?
Definitely. I think, well, let's face it, I think in the case of Japan, there is this very strong insider versus the outsider. So if you're a foreigner going to live in Japan as a resident, you are immediately not, you're going to be like slightly below the natives. And then, but if you are a Caucasian, a Westerner, you definitely fare a little better than, say, people who are from an Asian country. And it also depends on how well the country is doing. For example, if you're Asian but you're from Singapore, you do a little better than, say, people who are from Mainland China.
Right. So where does somebody from Mainland China fit in that ranking in Japan in the 1990s?
I would say fairly low. There has to do with how well the country is doing economically. I went through that experience living in Japan, and I had to constantly figure out how do I do it in such a way so that I'm gonna be regarded as slightly better than some of the other Asians in the pool.
Right.
So I tend to emphasize my American experience, my education from the U.S., and I would emphasize my Hong Kong experience. And if you're from Hong Kong, then again you fare a little better.
Right. So you left at quite a young age, under 5, I believe. How much do you think somebody leaving a country like China can take with them of that innate Chineseness when they're leaving at such a young age?
Well, I try to explore this quite a bit in Excess Baggage, because we talk about native speakers, and I think in Japan there's a very strong emphasis on, if they are looking for a language teacher, they always want to have a native speaker. But what does it really mean when you have more and more people who are so-called third culture kids, and they leave their country of origin, if you will, at a rather young age, and often they're learning 3 languages, simultaneously. Does it take away from their language of origin? So I guess the answer is I don't really know. Whether that doesn't make me less of a native speaker of Chinese, for example. Right. But I will say this, because I was taken out of my country of origin, I tried very hard to compensate. What do I mean by that? When I went to my graduate school, I majored in comparative cultures. Then I went to the U.S. and I got a lot of questions and people asking me, where are you from? Oh, you're originally from China. Then can you tell me how do you play mahjong? What is the Sun Tzu, strategy? All kinds of questions I wasn't really able to answer, and I felt very fake as a Chinese. Right. So I tried very hard to go back and study my own culture, and so I majored in Chinese language and literature. So that I would feel less like a fake. That's what I did.
Was that an experience that you found that many other people in that sort of situation also did, that they sort of almost overcompensated for not having grown up in the country where supposedly they are from?
It depends on the individual. For me, it was important because I remember when I was in the U.S., I have to constantly figure out, telling myself that, how do I, because in the U.S., you do have people who tend to put all the Asians in one basket. They call them the Orientals. And for me, I had to try very hard to figure out, well, how do I emphasize that I'm not just another Asian that you can qualify as an Oriental? So I had to keep myself very clear with my own identity. So one way I did this was I bought a J bracelet, and because that's one little item that would separate you from, say, a lot of the other Asians, because a Japanese certainly would not wear a J bracelet, so.
Going back to Chinese people in Japan, now given the troubled history of the two countries, does that make it particularly difficult for the Chinese immigrant community in Japan to get by, especially when, as at the moment, tensions rise between the two countries at a political level?
I do think so, because China and Japan had a difficult past in history. And I think a lot of the Chinese who live in Japan, they try very hard not to stand out, because Chinese and Japanese look very similar from the outset. So, and if you don't emphasize your last name, if you don't, if you learn to speak Japanese fluently, very few people would notice that you're actually, a foreigner.
So people consciously try to keep a low profile? I think
there is a lot of, because there's a proverb in Japanese that says that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. So it's not just with foreigners, even with the Japanese themselves. They try not to stick out. They try not to appear different. I know some of my friends, from China, from other parts of Asia, when they book a restaurant, they would try to make up some Japanese name, just for the sake of the ease, and also, say during Chinese New Year, it's not a holiday in Japan, so a lot of overseas Chinese did not celebrate Chinese New Year. Again,
whereas in the United States or even Britain, it's a huge event and it's celebrated even on.
That's a big difference, just because you're in another Asian country does not necessarily make your experience as an immigrant any less difficult. In a way, I think it's easier. In the U.S., you stand out anyway, so people learn that I should be proud of my heritage, and so they make a big deal, make big fuss of Chinese New Year, but not so much in Japan. In fact, I come across say second generation, third generation Chinese in Yokohama, and when I interview them for a story, they kind of sheepishly say, I'm very ashamed of the fact that I don't speak Chinese, but they try to blend in so hard that they kind of ignore their heritage.
Now, you did spend many years in the United States, but at a later stage, you went to India. Now, this is, we may hear little about Chinese people living in Japan, but the Chinese community in India is one that I personally have never heard any stories from. What exactly is the community like there, and do they have any particular problems or advantages even?
When I lived in New Delhi, up to about a year ago, I found it very difficult to find any kind of Chinese community in New Delhi because there is no Chinatown. And the one and only Chinatown that you will find in India is in Calcutta. And that community went back a long time ago, but the number of Chinese immigrants in that community has dwindled so much. And part of the reason is that China and India went to war in 1962. And it became a very difficult situation for a lot of the immigrants, because they essentially, it's not a very well publicized reality.
So they were interned during this period?
They were, yes, they were. And in fact, I came across a Chinese lady who had a couple of successful Chinese restaurants, and she told me about her experience, being one of these camps, and they were kept, depending on which part of India you're from, and she was kept there for quite long, 7 years.
But whereas in Japan you do have the option of sort of blending into the background, that's not really an option, certainly in parts of India, so you are going to be recognized. So you feel the community there has dwindled because of relations between the two countries?
Definitely. I think being a Chinese immigrant in India, in that part of, say, in Calcutta, hasn't been easy for a lot of them. And I think, things will hopefully will change now that with Xi Jinping and Modi talking. Hopefully that would be some areas they would address. But a lot of them actually have gone to, say, Canada and U.S., Australia, just because they found that being a Chinese Indian did not help at all for them to find jobs, and so.
Inevitably, some people return to China, mainland China. Sometimes it may be for a visit. In some cases, later on in their careers, they come back. What about this sort of sense that you again mention in this book, Excess Baggage, about the longing to go home, even if that home was left when you were 2 or 3 years old? Is that something you found amongst people living in the communities that you were living in?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about my experience. I did try to go home, because I grew up feeling all my problems of not feeling that I fit in. I'm always, feeling this sense that I'm an outsider. So perhaps if I go home, I would be better accepted, except that I did try when I went back to home in Dalian, and I felt like, wait a minute, I can never be like them either, because I haven't grown up that way. All this history that everybody else in China went through, I never went through. So I found the biggest difference, the most difficult thing for me to get adjusted to is the values. The values are so different. I was raised in such a way that money does not mean a lot to me, whereas I think China went through, maybe is still going through this phase of like wanting to make as much money as they can. And I can understand where they're coming from, because for such a long time they have been, controlled in this bubble where, they cannot, they didn't have enough food to eat, and then they have no choices, and suddenly the doors open, and then they can, they have this opportunity.
But for whatever reason, it's something that you find difficult to share.
And I find that I couldn't understand. It's not important to me. So this going back home is more of an emotional wish, if you will, and I think that often, I don't think I'm an exception. I think a lot of the other, immigrants, they have this dream, of wanting to go home, and then sooner or later they find out that they can't really go home, and they have to find another place.
Home is more ephemeral than they think. It's not just a geographical location.
Right.
The other side, the returnees, the attitude from people in China to people who return, there does seem to be a sort of a mixed attitude. Again, something that you mention in your novel, where there's sort of, on one side, envy. I wish I was in New York and the streets are paved with gold and you're so successful. On the other hand, very quick to condemn the person for having lost their Chineseness or not sharing the values, as you say. Is that a difficulty for somebody coming back?
I think part of it depends on how long the gap has been. In my family's case, my sister, did not find the rest of the family for almost 3 decades. So I think for the family members that moved on first, and then coming back to face this new member who has come later, much later. There's a lot of culture clashes, but then, for example, my mother's case, 30 years gap, she still had this sort of romanticized notion about China, when in fact China, as you lived here, changes so quickly. So again, going back, how long have you been away? I mean, in my case, I just been back. I live in Beijing 5 years ago, and I left for India. I'm back. I found quite a lot of things have changed. So I think that feeling, this coming back returnee, again, that just depends on if it's been a long gap. Yeah, they're going to find that it's going to feel like an alien, a very strange country. And I befriended a Chinese friend in India. She's, she used to live in Beijing, and she's one of the earlier ones who moved away from China, to she got married with an American gentleman, and who's a diplomat. So she told me that she used to be the envy of the family. Oh, you got to go to travel away. You're going to be so set up, for wealth and what have you. And then she said, a few years later, they have pity on me because I'm the poorest in the family. My brother and my sister shower me, with pocket money. I said, what? You're 35 and you're still getting pocket money? Did you truly feel sorry for me? So that is how fast China has been changing.
In one of the characters in the book, Pei, is the girl who's actually left behind, so she'd be the equivalent of your sister. At one stage in the book, she has a chance to go home, or she's asked, do you want to go home? She says, no, I can't go home because I haven't been a success, or I'm not successful enough, and I will have to go back and bring presents and show off. Does this happen? Do people not want to come back because they feel they haven't made enough of themselves and they're going to be embarrassed?
Definitely. I feel there's this stereotype, there's this wrong notion that once you've moved away to a more wealthy country, that invariably you'll come home a success. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to debunk this myth. What if the family members who moved on to another country turn out to be a failure, And it's not always going to be a success story. And so in Pei's case, as much as like the other extended family, Pei was very surprised to find out that the family members who moved to Japan, moved to Hong Kong, actually were nothing. They haven't made anything of themselves. And so she herself followed in their footsteps. And she also found that she wanted so much to make. She had this dream of making lots of money and be a success. And lo and behold, she found out actually life could be quite tough outside. And all these stories that she has been hearing, a lot of them are not true. So she had this burden of trying to figure out, well, if I do go home, see my relatives, what am I going to say to them? Well, how do I show them that I'm a success? Not only is this expectation, there's also, the expectation of getting a lot of gifts, and you share the wealth, if you will.
Do you think that this is going to be more difficult for a Chinese person returning to China than, say, somebody going back to Germany or to Mexico, where it's not only the expectation that you will do well, but you're also expected to behave in a certain way, to spread that out amongst the family back home?
I do think so. Especially, I think maybe in the city, people are slightly more savvy. They're more aware of the outside world. But in the village, in the countryside, there's still this kind of this myth about oh, you made it outside, you must be so wealthy. Although having said that, there are a lot of these nouveau riche people. In certain parts of China, they have also made it very wealthy. So maybe. China is changing. There's a lot of eclectic, facts happening simultaneously. Some parts of China, people are getting so wealthy. When I was in New Delhi, at this very fancy mall selling nothing but name brands, I saw so many Chinese. So again, I wrote the book. This is based on 1990s, and I find that China is really changing so quickly that a lot of the facts are also changing.
Right. So the experience of this family is not something that perhaps is going to be replicated in 2014. There's another experience out there.
I think there's got to be another experience, and then again, depends on which part of China you're from.
And another phenomenon which obviously didn't exist at this time is, while China is not a country that welcomes immigrants, there are substantial numbers of foreigners moving here to China, especially to the bigger cities on the East Coast. And they're moving here not just for the experience, but in many cases Americans are coming because out of college they can make better money here. Right. So do you think this will affect the view of people in China, that they are suddenly saying, well, you don't have to go outside to make money. Look, here are these foreigners actually coming here to make money.
I do think that there is a sense that there's a rising, pride with a lot of the Chinese people. Hey, we are the country who can provide opportunities for a lot of the Laowai, for the foreigners as well. So in fact, it would be very interesting to see what would happen, with these foreigners, whether they might choose to, whether they would consider become an immigrant, long-term resident of China, and whether China would have a new policy, with these foreigners. Yes.
You mentioned earlier on this thing, as you called it, a third culture or a hybrid culture. And this is also a phrase that one of the characters in this book mentions, finding that she's not at home in Japan, she's not at home really in the United States, nor is she in China. As more people travel around the world, many of them Chinese simply because there are so many Chinese in the world. Do you feel this is something that this third culture, and I guess you would put yourself into that category, that's something that is going to become more common?
I do think so. We're hearing a lot of Chinese parents investing a lot in the education, like putting their kids in American colleges or high schools, Canada as well, in Australia as well. So I think, in about another 10 years, we'll definitely hear more, Chinese parents and kids maybe start talking about this third culture kid experience. And I see that coming up. Maybe not so much talked about. This is still quite new, quite raw, but I expect to hear a lot more.
Many of these people or families are moving with young children, some of them like you were when you left, 3 or 4 years old. As somebody who's gone through this, do you feel that there is a sort of a limit at the age at which a child can integrate into a new society? Almost like language learning. We hear about children up to sort of 5, maybe 10 years old, can pick up a language natively. If they're sort of 18 or so, they may speak the new language very, very well, but they'll never be natives. Do you think something similar applies to that integration into a new society, for example, a Chinese person or a Chinese family moving to Canada or even to Britain?
I think there's a bit of, it depending on the individual. I do think that, when you look at the term third culture kid, they very much emphasize the formative years. By that, experts mean 0 to 18. Those are life-changing years. So I think a lot of the third culture kids, they move from country to country, and there would be a couple countries or cultures that they will identify a lot more closely with than, say, even their own country of origin, and because maybe those years have really impacted, their experience. But if by the time you're 18, you can still, acquire a language and speak it fluently, and maybe have the culture, but maybe the impact would be slightly less so than, say, those first 18 years in one's life. But I do think that it's still very good to have those experiences, whether you're 18 or slightly older and go to a foreign country. It really opens up your eyes to see there are different ways of looking at things. Even though I struggle a lot as a young person, growing up in different cultures and feeling like,
wondering where home was.
Rootless, yeah. But looking back, I really do think that I feel like I have more better ways of resolving problems, creative ways of resolving problems. And I don't say things, I have a different way of looking at things, of this is absolutely right, absolutely wrong. I think we need more people who can help out with resolving world problems, in a more creative, more objective ways. Hopefully, with more kids coming up as, experiencing different cultures, that our society would be slightly better, hopefully.
Have you plans to follow this up with anything else?
I've always been interested in people who are caught in the middle, cross-cultural, like people, for example, there are a group of Japanese people who were stuck in China. And
this was at the end of the war.
At the end of the war, they're called the returnees from the war. I had an opportunity to work with these people as an interpreter for a film project, so I always found those experiences fascinating. So to get back to your question, I think that my next project will also be related to some sort of cross-cultural experiences, although I haven't quite decided whether it would be a fiction or non-fiction project, but.
Well, whether it takes place in India, New York, Tokyo or Beijing, the best of luck in documenting those people stuck in between the cultures. Karen Ma, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.